Today we are here with Enid Keyes. We are recording an interview for celebrating our wildlife conservation heritage. We are in Anchorage, Alaska, and today is December 17th, 2021. Enid, I'm really glad you could be here with us today.
Thank you.
I look forward.
Pleased.
Really look forward to this conversation. Your name has been part of my entire career with wildlife biology in the state of Alaska, and so it's a big honor to have a chance to sit down with you and talk about what your history has been as a wildlife biologist in Alaska. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I look forward to hearing about what it was like when you got started.
All right. Let me just say that it's an equally large honor for me to be here and to have you ask me about my career. That means a great deal.
Well, we are very fortunate to be able to be here together. So Enid, to get started, when and where were you born?
I was born in Colorado in 1947.
Okay. And what part of Colorado?
Oh, Denver.
Okay.
Yeah. And right after I was born, I left the hospital and went up to the mountains in the middle of the state of Colorado, up about 8,000 feet.
So what things growing up influenced your interest in nature?
Oh, a number of things. My folks at the time lived on a 200-acre ranch. My dad was a fox farmer, and my parents were very outdoors oriented, and we spent a large amount of time hiking and camping and going on picnics and just being outdoors. We never played, my sister and I never played in the house. We always were outdoors, and that's where it started. My dad was extremely interested in nature. He was a pharmacist by training. He had a pre-med background, so biology was his great love. And he was an outdoorsman. He hunted and he fished, and he didn't teach me to hunt, but he taught me to fish. And that was when biology first grabbed me, when I learned how to fish and when I learned how to dissect a fish. My dad taught me how to do that, and I know he had an ulterior motive, because from that time forward I cleaned all the fish and loved every bit of it.
That's a good way to get started, certainly. So I'm sure in the 1950s, Colorado was different than it is today.
Vastly different.
Yeah.
Vastly different. In the area where my folks had their farm, it was 2 miles to the nearest house as the crow flew, and now it's just little teeny subdivisions in that whole area. It's little teeny lots packed with cabins and houses, and people commute. It's 50 miles from Denver, and they commute into Denver to work every day. It's a bedroom community, but it's greatly changed. Yeah.
Yeah, Alaska has certainly changed quite a bit since then too.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the ranch like that you grew up on?
Well, like I said, it was 200 acres, and it was there were some cleared fields, and the rest of it was thick woods, not like Alaskan woods. The ground there's no ground cover, and so you could walk through the woods without a machete or a trail. So that was a lot of fun, and I spent a lot of time roaming around the woods. And there was a favorite place I used to go to, which was a giant boulder pile, and down at the bottom of the boulder pile was an active bear den. And I loved to go in there and poke around. I never met the bear, but I loved to go in there and think about it.
You're a brave young woman to do something like
yeah,
that.
I'm afraid so.
And maybe a little bit lucky too.
Yeah.
So when you were growing up, were there any books or events or people that really started to influence your interest in nature?
Well, there were several people and one book. The book that got me to Alaska wasn't exactly about nature, because it was fiction, but it was Jack London's White Fang. I loved that book, and it seemed like such a grand adventure to be in Alaska. And it was because of that book that I had wanted to come up here for all of my childhood and as a young adult, and eventually I got up here. My dad was the primary person that inspired me and taught me about nature. He was a great teacher, and he was very knowledgeable, and we would go on walks together, just he and I, and he would teach me what the trees were and how they grew and what the grasses were and why they were important for the wildlife, and he showed me the places where animals lived, and he taught me how to be quiet in the woods so I would see more wildlife, and he was just a tremendous inspiration. And then when I got to college age, I had developed a great love for literature, and I wanted to major in English Lit, and he said no, that you had to be able to make a living, and you couldn't make a living with English Lit, you had to go into science. And so again, I took his advice, and that was some of the best advice I ever got. It served me well, and it was his upbringing and his teaching was a tremendous inspiration for me. And the other person that inspired me tremendously was a teacher named Don Bolin. When I was in high school, I went to a really highly rated high school at the time. It was one of the top 5 high schools in the nation at that time, Wheat Ridge High School in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. And Mr. Bolin was our biology teacher, and he was the top rated biology teacher in the nation for the 2 years that I had him. And he was an amazing teacher. He was just so inspiring, and we did lots of hands-on experiments and had to write papers, and we did a lot of things that most other people didn't do until they got into college. And because of his teaching, then I knew that I was going to go into biology if I possibly could, English Lit notwithstanding. But yeah, that was my other main impetus.
It's incredible what a difference 1 or 2 people can absolutely make in the course of your life, whether they realize it at the time or not. What kind of, you said that your dad used to take you fishing, what kind of fish would you catch?
He was a consummate fly fisherman. He fished for trout. He never taught his daughters to fly fish because I don't think he thought we could do it well enough. So we were taught to fish with spinners and bait. And I fished for trout in Colorado. Whatever trout he was catching, that's what we tried to catch.
That's certainly a good way to spend some days. So you talked a little bit about what you went into in college, but where did you go to college, and how did you choose your major, and what did that path look like?
I went to Colorado State University, and I took my coursework in the College of Veterinary Medicine, and I was in microbiology. I started out as a medical technology major, and then I switched midstream to microbiology, and that's what I got my degree in, with a minor in English Lit and a minor in chemistry. But
And that certainly sounds like a good, well-rounded course load.
yeah, well, the English Lit kept the chemistry from being too deadly.
Were there certain classes that you took that really kind of cemented your love of biology?
Well, there were several. In microbiology, in my micro courses, I did several special studies classes where I had a research project assigned to me, and then I had to carry the whole thing out and write a paper on it at the end. And for quite some time here, since we talked the other day, I've been trying to think of the name of this bacteria that I was assigned to isolate, and it was a giant bacterium, quite large. You can't see it with the naked eye, of course, but on a microscope it was quite large, and it was flagellated, which means it had little tiny hair-like appendages that provided motility for it so it could swim around. And my job was to isolate that, and it was only found in fresh steer manure. And so my first job in bacteriology was to run around behind a Brahma bull in the field with a little collecting device, you know, a little spatula and a test tube, and as soon as they pooped, then I had to run over there and keep an eye on the steer and get my sample and run off to the lab and culture it. And I did end up getting it. I found it.
So being a biologist is as glamorous as people say it is.
Oh, it is. It is.
Absolutely. So after that, and you finished college, what brought you to Alaska?
Well, I had worked for a brief period of time at the National Center for Atmospheric Research doing work on aerosol biology, and the funding for that ended. And I was looking for something to do after that. And I met a person who told me about a job in Alaska doing editing at the university. And I had done quite a bit of editing, and for a while to earn my way through a little bit of college, I was a tutor for the freshman football team. And I didn't edit their reports, I wrote their reports. That was what the tutor was instructed to do, was to write their papers for them. So I had a pretty good background at that point in editing and writing, and so I thought that sounded good. The job was at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and so without even knowing whether I would get the job or not, I hopped on a plane and came up here to Alaska, and that job did not materialize, but within a fairly short period of time, I found a full-time job as a soils technician, a microbiology technician at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Forest Soils Lab up on the West Ridge in Fairbanks. And our first office was in the old Arctic Health Building. And I inherited, as my office space, a whole wing of labs that had been, the Arctic Biology Center, I think, was closed down not too long before I got up there in '73. And I don't remember the reason why. Government funding was suspended, and it had been a federally funded lab, big building with lots of labs in it. And they just walked off and left all the equipment and everything in the labs. And so I walked in, and so that I had my own suite of labs. It was quite exciting. But there was only me in there, so. But it was a lot of fun, and I did some interesting research on three-dimensional mapping of the soil water systems in the floodplain for the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab. It was an Army project, and my supervisor, Dr. Keith Van Cleve, he had funding for that, so I spent 4 years, almost 5 years, doing that research for him.
Oh, that's pretty incredible. So you moved straight from Colorado to Fairbanks?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then where else in Alaska have you lived since then?
Just Fairbanks and Anchorage, and now Homer, where I live now.
Okay. You're making the rounds across the state. So with that, you started working as a microbiologist,
Mm-hmm.
and then how did your career progress from there?
I was married at the time, and my husband had gotten a job in Anchorage, and so I had to move to Anchorage, and I needed a job, and the first place I applied to was Department of Fish and Game and the Fisheries Division. Roger Grishkowski was running the Fisheries Lab at the time, and I interviewed with him, and I did not get the job, but I figured that this was probably a pretty good place to work, and so I kept trying, and eventually I heard about a job offered in the in what was then the game division. And so I went in to interview for that, and it was a 2-month temporary position as a technician, I think a Tech 3. And one of the biologists had been reassigned, who had been working in the lab, had been reassigned to Yakutat, I believe. And so they needed somebody on a temporary basis. So I got the job. The man who hired me was Charlie Lucier, and you have to be a real old-timer to know who Charlie Lucier was. But he was not the typical wildlife biologist. You know, typical wildlife biologists are, I mean, they pretty much big, tall, strapping, healthy, robust fellows that spend a lot of time in the outdoors. And Charlie was about 5 feet tall, little tiny guy, and he was fairly effeminate in his gestures. He just was very different from the people at Fish and Game. But he was a Renaissance man, and he was a good biologist, and he was also an archaeological historian. And so he was interested in different things than the biologists were interested in, but he provided a really interesting viewpoint in staff discussions and so on. And he was extremely well educated, very literate, and he and I got on famously. We became good friends. And when my job, my 2-month job ended, then I was offered a job as a permanent Tech 3. And I took that for a short period of time. And then I was hired as a wildlife biologist 1, a WB1, GB1 back then, game biologist. And then eventually that was flexed up to a 2. And then I stayed as a 2 for the next 20 years.
So how long in total were you with Fish and Game?
23 years.
That's quite a career.
Yeah.
I'm sure
we had 20-year retirement back then. If you were a biologist, you had 20-year retirement. And are you familiar with why the biologists all had 20-year retirement?
Mm-mm.
Because back in the beginning days, everybody was flying around in Piper Cubs, Super Cubs, and doing surveys up blind box canyons and going down low, doing game counts, that kind of thing. And there was a high mortality rate. Biologists were dying in plane crashes at a greater rate than police were dying in the line of work, in their line of duty. And so the union pushed through a 20-year retirement plan, same as it was for law enforcement officers, because of that high death rate. It was a hazardous position, and so they got a better retirement rate because of that. Because anybody working out in a small plane in the field was actually flying, and the weather conditions were iffy. I don't know how many people have died in crashes since I left, but there were 2 or 3 that died while I was working there. I mean, it was still a very dangerous job.
That's a very tragic way to lose your friends and coworkers, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a career that we love, but it can certainly be dangerous, like you said.
And it's something that you have to be committed to.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So when you were working in the lab, what kind of things were you doing?
I worked as a supply person. I purchased supplies for the area biologists in the region so that they could do their field work and do their biological sampling and so on. And I also had a federal drug license, a drug permit. I purchased, I didn't purchase, it wasn't the kind of permit that allowed me to purchase the capture drugs. That was a Schedule II permit, which required a higher level of approval. But I had approval to buy certain prescription type drugs, and my big item was ethanol for the lab. We bought as pure as you could get ethanol, and I had to weigh it a couple times a month and make sure that nothing was lost, and I had to account for any losses and record how much I used and so on and keep track of that. And of course, you can imagine how that was a subject of great joking and jocularity among the biologists, especially during the happy hours that we used to have. But I also purchased air motion sickness drugs for the biologists to use, so they wouldn't have problems in the back of an aircraft.
Those are definitely important things to
Yeah,
have.
they were important. Yeah.
What were you using the ethanol for?
Pardon me?
What was the ethanol used
Oh,
for?
I used it for various solutions in the lab. I used it for making up the staining solution that I used for staining bear teeth and so on. We just used it for a number of the chemical things in the lab. We made a preservative called Loess solution that was about 50% ethanol and some glycerin and a couple other little things in there. But yeah, we used a fair amount of it.
You mentioned that you were using it for staining the bear teeth.
Mm-hmm.
What was that process like, or what were you doing?
Well, as you know, when a bear is harvested by hunters or by researchers in this state, a small premolar tooth is pulled out of the animal, and then it's brought to the lab and it's decalcified in a hydrochloric acid solution and alcohol, and it's then, when it's kind of like a firm rubber eraser in its feel, then it's rinsed for 12 hours in running water, and then it was put on a freezing microtome, which is a thin sectioning machine, and it was basically a little unit that was about 3 feet high and maybe 2 feet wide, and it had a compartment inside that was frozen. Everything in it was ultra cold, and there was a big blade about this long, about 6 or 8 inches long, with an extremely sharp edge on it, and that was in a clamp, and you had to adjust the angle and everything, and you had to make I think we used I don't remember the exact micron thickness of those sections, but they were thinner than the thickness of a human hair. And you sliced the tooth, and you had to aim for the exact angle through the center of the tooth, so you got a good long longitudinal section through that tooth, and you could see the cementum and a straight shot down the root. And that way you could stain the tooth then with a hematoxylin regressive stain, which means that you would overstain it and then remove the stain using alcohol, and get it to the point where you could see the definition of the rings in the cementum annuli, and then you could look at it under a microscope and determine the age of the animal. You knew about when that first ring was laid down. It was called the cub line, and then you could count the rings, which could be very, very challenging. Old bears and when they've had a disease, or there's been times when they didn't have enough food, it messes up the cementum annuli layering, and it makes it pretty interesting to try to follow a single line all the way around a tooth to make sure that that's a 1-year line. So it was interesting work, and there were about 1,000 bear teeth, black bear teeth, brought in every year by hunters, and there were approximately 500 brown bears brought in by hunters, and then there were maybe a couple hundred research teeth on a good year, less than that sometimes, from research animals. And some of those were known age animals, and so getting the age of a tooth, when an animal was captured, we'd pull out a premolar tooth when a bear was collared, and a tooth would be taken out, and we'd determine their age at that point, and then we knew how long that bear had its collar on, and at various times throughout the period of time they were being observed, we would dart them again, check their collars, of course, and pull another tooth. And They had 4 premolars, so you only got 4 chances at it. But that was how we worked with. And some animals, they knew when they came out of the den as cubs. And so those were, of course, the finest research animals because you knew for sure how old they were. And you could track them throughout their lives.
That's interesting. I've read a number of the papers written on aging bears off of their teeth, and it's a practice that we still do today, except we send it out to a much larger lab and have them do it. Were you a one-person operation for aging all of the bear teeth in Alaska?
I was. Well, at first I was. It wasn't just me. It was me and Lee Miller, who was a Tech 5 in the office, and he was a legend. He was a living legend. And I wish I had time to tell you some stories about Lee Miller because he was phenomenal. But he did the first aging, and he taught me how to age teeth. And then when I was good enough, then I took on all of it, and I did all the aging.
That's a lot of teeth to go through every year.
It's a lot of teeth. And I have a certificate to prove it that Wayne Reglan gave me at my retirement party, that at one time I held the world's record for the largest number of bear teeth cut, sectioned, and stained in red. So for a brief time, I had a world record in something. It became actually more expensive than they wanted to deal with for me to do that. And there was some controversy after. There was a lab that, and you may still do business with this guy, Gary Mattson in Montana, started up a lab, and he provided aging services and other processing of biological specimens. And so we started sending some of our teeth out to him and then comparing the ages that he came up with what we had. And eventually there became some discrepancies that were of concern because the way I had learned and the way Lee Miller had learned was just by trying to figure it out on your own. And it worked very well most of the time, but not all of the time. And they needed more accuracy in the reading of the teeth. And so they eventually contracted out to Mattson, and he took over. And so he's probably got the world record now for perpetuity.
Yeah, and certainly being able to get the ages off of animals, the cementum layers in the bear teeth, or the age rings and doll sheep horns, and things like that, that's still very much such a significant portion of what we do when we're looking at our research animals. It's interesting that that's kind of how it got started. And that was at the Anchorage Fish and Game office, is that right?
It was in Anchorage, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a woman who had my equivalent job position up in Fairbanks. She was in the lab up there, and she aged that region's research teeth, but I got all of the harvest teeth for the whole state. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big workload. That's impressive.
Well, I also, I didn't just do bear teeth. I got to go out in the field some of the time too. So, yeah, that was, the bear teeth just came in and had to be cut during one time of the year, and the rest of the time I was free to do other projects and stuff.
So what other kinds of projects did you get to work on then?
I did a project for Sterling Miller. We were trying to see if we could use thin layer chromatography to differentiate between brown bear scat and black bear scat. And if we could, then we wanted to see if we could differentiate between individual brown bears on the basis of thin layer chromatography. But what we found was, and we gave it a good college try, but what we found was that there's so much undigested salmon and or blueberries and berries in their gut most of the time that that, blueberry juice kind of just overwhelms a thin layer chromatograph, and so does salmon. And so you really couldn't see anything specific without a whole lot more sophisticated techniques than we were set up to do. So that was one of those that didn't pan out very well, but it was fun. It was interesting to do. And I got to run around collecting bear poop.
From steers to bears.
Yes, yes. I also spent a little bit of time developing a staining technique, same technique that we used for brown and black bears for wolves. I did that for Warren Ballard. And we developed a viable technique for aging them using not the premolar, but it's a premolar. It's behind the canine, but it was a little bit larger tooth, and but it worked. We were able to do that as well. Warren and I published a little paper on that.
I've seen your name on a number of papers over the years. It seems like you've had a good history of publications with certainly the Department of Fish and Game.
A little bit, yeah.
Just a few. Yeah. So what year did you retire officially from Fish and Game?
I retired in 2000.
Okay.
I think it was 2000, yeah. When was 9/11? That was in 2000?
2001.
Then that's the year I retired, was 2001, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, one of the stories that you had shared with me before had to do with a bear tooth that was a little more unusual than some of the others.
Yes.
Did you want to talk about that?
Well, to my shame, I suppose I should. Chuck Schwartz, who was a black bear researcher down at the moose pens in Soldotna, and he wanted me to do, he had some friends who were archaeologists, and they had come upon a cave of some sort. I don't even remember where they were from, but they had come upon a cave that had a prehistoric bear in it, and they were able to get a tooth from the skull. It was the skeleton had been preserved and mostly fossilized, and so they brought me these two teeth that were, I don't know if you've ever seen a tooth pulled out of, you probably have, out of a skull, a fresh one. It's white and it's smooth and hard, and this one had, have you ever seen fossilized ivory in the round? It kind of has flakes on it that some of the layers have come off, and it looks brown and kind of gnarly. That's what this tooth looked like, both of these teeth. And so they wanted me to determine the age on it, and they wanted me to use my techniques for the bears on this bear. And so that's what I did. And these were priceless specimens. They couldn't be repeated. And so with some trepidation and a whole lot of ignorance, I decalcified it, both the teeth, and they just vanished in the decalcifying solution. And Chuck Schwartz was not a happy man, and neither was I a happy woman. It was very, very disappointing, and I felt really bad that I had let these people down, but I just didn't know how to do it. And I thought, and they thought, that it would work, but it didn't.
When you only have a sample size of one, that's
yeah.
very challenging for sure. Thinking back on your time working for the Department of Fish and Game and being in Alaska, and as a biologist starting out, what were some of the biggest challenges to being a biologist during that time?
To being a biologist in general, or to me? There's a little bit of a difference.
Let's start with being a biologist in general, and then
Okay.
and then
All
how
right.
that worked for you.
I think, again, I think politics is always a challenge for any biologist. You come out of school and you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you think you're going to do a really wonderful job managing your wildlife or researching wildlife, but particularly managing it. And you get in a job like at Fish and Game and you find out that you have sometimes extremely grumpy or irate or hostile public to deal with, and you have politicians to deal with, and you have community leaders to deal with, and it can be tremendously frustrating. And I think for a lot of guys, especially starting out, back then especially, it was those were the days of Anilka, those were the days of subsistence, those were the days of wolf control, and all of those were really politicized, of course, and it was very difficult for the biologists. There was a lot of hair tearing and muttering and cursing, not in public, but it was very difficult for people to do their jobs and to do them well and to apply the biology that they knew was the right biology to use. It was very hard. I think that was probably the biggest challenge back then. I can't really speak to what the challenges are now, but I don't expect that they're a whole lot dissimilar.
Who were some of the major people involved during that time?
Well, in the department, Wayne Reglan, who was, Lou Pamplin, and Ron Somerville was real involved in subsistence. And I don't remember who came after Ron. Do you recall?
I don't recall.
It might have been Lou Pamplin. I don't remember. But they were involved, of course, and all the regional supervisors were involved. Who was the regional supervisor in Fairbanks? His name was Dick. During the wolf days.
Mm-hmm. I don't recall.
Really nice man, and he got hit with the wolf control stuff real hard up there because of predator-prey relationships and that kind of thing. And down in Region 2, the biologists, Ted Spraker, Gino Delfrate, Sterling Idy, Lou Pamplin, I'm sure, was also involved in that to some extent. And the regional supervisors, wasn't Carl Schneider. He was research coordinator at that time, and he got involved. Just the upper level staff, I think statewide, were hit with that very, very hard because they had to deal with the political end of things. And the area biologists, I remember Ted Spraker being in a meeting. The federal people were there, Fish and Wildlife Service was there, community leaders were there, hunters were there, and I thought fistfights were going to break out. There were words shouted. I mean, really, it was disturbing how much incipient violence there was in the room. It was scary, and that's what those guys had to deal with back then. There were death threats made. People would call the office and threaten to blow up cars in the parking lot and threaten biologists' lives. It was not a fun period of time.
And this was in the late 70s?
It was in the late 70s, yeah.
Okay.
Early 80s, yeah.
Yeah. Those are certainly tumultuous times.
Yeah, I'm sure Ted Spraker has a few things to say about that. He was pro-wolf control, of course, but they served it up to him really hard.
So one of the things that you mentioned was, in addition to the challenges of just being a biologist with all of those things going on, that there were other challenges above and beyond that, or what were your personal challenges?
Well, there were challenges for the guys that were the area biologists and the researchers. They spent a huge amount of time up in small airplanes, doing censuses, doing radio tracking. We had and there were a number of non-fatal accidents, plane crashes. Susan Bowen was a technician who was in one of those and walked away from it. And a number of those happened. There was at least one helicopter crash, that kind of thing. I knew a technician, Larry Ahmiller. You probably know of him, legendary for the brown bear sanctuary at McNeil River, and he worked for Warren Ballard up out of I can't remember the name of the town. I'm having a blank. I'm sorry.
The Palmer office?
Beyond Palmer.
Glen Allen?
Glen Allen.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Old brain. He worked out of the Glen Allen office doing radio tracking, and he spent all day, pretty much every day, up in a plane, flying in small circles, in all kinds of weather, over all kinds of terrain. And he figured, he walked into the office one day, and Warren was in the office down in Anchorage, and he came in and he told Warren he wasn't going to fly for him anymore. He'd quit. He wasn't quitting his job, but he was quitting flying. And Warren was flabbergasted, and he said, "Why in the world would you do that?" And Larry said, in all seriousness, he said, "You only have so much luck, and the more you do something, the faster your luck is going to run out." And he said, "My luck is going to run out, and I'm not going to push it to that point. So I'm not going to fly anymore." And that's what he did. He never got up in another plane and did any more radio tracking. So Dennis McAllister got up in the plane and did it after that. But they respected that because they knew that he was right. You know, you fly enough hours, sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. So that was, I think, the biggest challenge. Working with researchers was a big challenge to work with some of the drugs that they used for capture and immobilization. There were some close calls with drugs. I've had at least one close call with the drugs. Not being in danger by the drugs personally, but having them not work on the animals as well as we thought they would. But I remember having to give a seminar for the biologists, teaching them. We started using a drug called M5050 and M99. And M99 was the drug that we used, and M5050 was the antidote. And if you injected yourself, at this point in time, you'd be up in a helicopter, and you'd be loading your dart gun, your dart syringe with a syringe with the drug in it. And if you hit a bump, a little turbulence, or the aircraft turned suddenly, you could easily inject yourself with this. And if you did, you had just about 30 seconds to live. And if you did inject yourself, then what you had to do was have a syringe full of M5050 on hand and inject under your tongue in order to save your life. And so I had to teach these guys how to do this and to impress upon them, because they had gotten fairly cavalier about it. And I remember flying behind Warren Ballard one time in a helicopter, and he was loading a syringe, and something happened, and it bumped, and he squirted the M99 up behind his glasses. And it didn't get in his eye, but I don't know how it didn't get in his eye. And if he'd gotten it in his eye, he could have died. But he laughed it off, and it was my job to teach them the seriousness of that. I'm not sure they listened all that well, but they were more careful after that. We insisted on it. We developed a protocol then for we loaded the syringes on the ground. We didn't do it in the plane or the helicopter. And we had a set protocol for dealing with things like that, with dealing with accidents. And there was one researcher outside. He was working with, I don't know what species he was working with, but he managed to inject a full syringe full in his leg. And it was only because somebody else was there with him with a syringe of antidote that saved his life. So it was deadly serious. And I was greatly relieved when they started taking things a little bit more seriously.
Wow. It's incredible to think about. I think when a lot of people have a concept of wildlife biology or working with wildlife, that the danger is from the animals that we work with, and just based on some of your stories, it reminds me that in many cases it's all of the other parts of the job. The animal is not always the most dangerous thing that we're working on.
It can work that way, yeah. We can be a greater danger.
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about some of the major political issues during that time with predator control and some of the other things that were going on. Was there anything else that really stood out as a pressing issue?
I think those were, subsistence of course was a big deal, really big deal, and that was a very volatile issue. It went down hard in a lot of sectors, but there was also a fairness to it. Everybody was afraid of it being abused, but I think it probably worked out. It incited a lot of anger on the part of the Native community for sure, and a lot of anger on the part of especially people living out in the bush that were not part of the Native community, but it wasn't nearly as volatile a situation as the wolf control was.
What do you think were some of the biggest changes you saw during your career? 23 years is a long time.
Well, we talked about that earlier, and I mentioned the politicization of biology, but I think beyond that, and we've already kind of talked about that, I think the other thing, the biggest change that I saw was bringing desktop computers to the office and putting a computer on every biologist's desk. When I started there, nobody had computers. There wasn't, I mean, desktop computers were quite new still, available to research outfits. When I worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, we had the largest computer in the world in there, and it took up an area about the size of this building. That was the computer. And of course, that was back in the days of punched computer cards. And so when I went to work at Fish and Game in 1978, that wasn't a whole long time after that. There were still just rudimentary computers, and we had to send all of our data off to be key punched if we were going to have it computerized at all. And Suzanne Miller started working for the department, and she was a biometrician, and she really believed in the concept of desktop computers, and so she worked a deal with IBM, tried to work a deal with IBM, and I think we ended up with HP. That might have been, I'm not really sure who the first maker of the computers that we had, who that was, but she arranged for a number of people that expressed an interest when she inquired if they wanted to have a desktop computer, and would they be willing to try and learn on it how to use it. And I raised my hand. I thought that sounded pretty spiffy because of my experience at NCAR. And so I got a computer. Several other people, and all the researchers, I think, were really gung-ho about that. And the area biologists they were suspicious, and they weren't too sure about it. But Suzanne prevailed, as she seemed to do most of the time throughout her career. She was a real character. She still is, I'm sure. She prevailed, and eventually everybody that worked as a biologist in the office and in the regional offices throughout the region, they got desktop computers and a screen, and those were computer technicians were hired to maintain those machines, and people were taught how to use them. There were classes, and The biologists, the area biologists were dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And a number of them never did quite fall in love with it. They grumbled and grouched all the years I knew them. But a fair number of them really embraced it. And so the ways of collecting data and the ways of analyzing data and presenting data and thinking about it changed drastically with the advent of the use of computers. And certainly for the researchers, it made their lives so much easier to be able to do analyses right there, to do their graphics, to prepare their publications, to do all of the stuff that they had to do. It made their lives so much easier. And then, of course, Suzanne made sure that there was an information management section created that dealt with all the data. And through her vision, she instituted the Wildlife Information Database, and that was quite a huge project. And then as the final outcome of that, back then, was the Harvest Summary database and the Harvest Summary book that I eventually ended up editing.
Was that when, was it called Big Diff? Was that part of that?
BGDIF, yeah.
Yeah.
Big Game Data Information. I don't remember what the F stood for, but yeah, that's what it was.
What year do you recall?
Oh boy. When was the Valdez oil spill? What year was that? It was right around that time. I was working on the Harvest Summary book during that year, and a couple years after and a couple years before, so it was bracketed around that time in my mind. Yeah.
Those Harvest Summaries are interesting to go back and look at. And
they were, you know, the interesting thing about the Harvest Summary books, it was a compilation of all the harvest data from all the hunters for all the species throughout the state. And it was all it was compiled in table form, and it was an enormous job. We had to. Susan Bowen worked for me, and Becky Strow worked. I say they worked for me, but we worked together. We were really just a team, and Becky did all of the. She did all of the formatting of the book on her computer. She had this really magnificent computer system back in her office, and she was a wizard with it. She could do anything. And Susan, who has one of the finest analytical minds I've ever met, and critically analytical, she could spot errors and discrepancies like nobody I've ever been able to see. And then I did the editing. I wrote all the text in the books, and also my job was to rewrite the regulations as they actually occurred, because throughout a harvest year, special orders, emergency orders are issued, and bag limits may change, and permit areas may change, and that kind of thing. And all those changes we kept track of those for each year, and then I went in after the fact and changed the regulations to the way they actually were in the end. So we had a record of how it was in the before and after. And the whole thing was envisioned to be a product for use by the public, by hunters, not by the area biologists. And so that's the way we geared the presentation. And the area biologists completely misunderstood that. They thought it was for them. And they didn't like the way it was done because they wanted certain things that wouldn't have been of any interest to the hunters. And so there were some arguments about that, especially in the beginning. And it was hard to pull data out of those guys sometimes. One of the toughest ones to pull data out of was Jack Whitman. Do you remember Jack Whitman? He was a fur bearer biologist, and I think he ended his career up in, Tom Paraguay sent me a book that he wrote. But he ended up his career in Fairbanks. And Jack liked to keep a hold of his data. And he didn't want to publish his data. and a number of the guys didn't like the idea of putting hard numbers down because, in fact, there's a lot of softness to a lot of data. And it's kind of hard to explain, but there are mitigating factors, and especially in the Native community, it was difficult to get an actual count of the number of animals harvested. They were trying to protect their right to harvest, and they didn't like to, frequently, they didn't like to report an accurate place or an accurate number of animals that were taken, and the biologists were aware of that, and they worked with that in the community. They had a pretty good sense of how many animals were taken, but the numbers were not hard and fast. And it worked in the community. It worked because everybody kind of knew. But when you put it down on paper and you insist on the exact number, that can cause a little bit of discomfort in some arenas. And that's what the dynamic was at that point. So yeah, getting data out of some of these guys, and some of them just didn't like to write the numbers down and give them to us. They had better things to do. But we got it, and it was a huge effort to get that book published. It was a 24-hour stint at the very end where we stayed up for 24 hours to get it to the publisher, and after that we went on vacation.
A well-earned one.
We left
I'm
and
certain.
went on vacation. Yeah.
You mentioned a few other people that you worked with during that time. Were there very many other women who were wildlife biologists at the level you were working at?
Well, there were women up in Fairbanks. Kathy Frost was one. I think she's been interviewed in this series. Kathy Harms was another one. And I was one, and Nancy Tankersley. She came in, I believe, 4 or 5 years after I started there. She came in as a non-game biologist. And so she had a lot of the same challenges that I did, being a woman in that office, yeah.
One of the other programs that I think you were involved with was the Becoming an Outdoors Woman
I
program.
was involved in that for a little while, yeah. I worked with Kathy Harms on that and got to go to Kelowna, BC in order to take some training for it, and I got to help out with 2 or 3 actual get-togethers for the Becoming an Outdoors Woman, and that was an exciting program. I don't know if it's still being done or not, but it was a very exciting program because women were exposed to all of the cool things that you can do in the outdoors, and at that point when we started doing that, there were actually manufacturers producing outdoor gear for women. When I started, if I needed hip boots to go in the field, I had to go buy men's hip boots, and you can't really find a size 5 men's hip boot. And when I worked I worked for marine mammals on the Stellar Sea Lion project, I needed a float suit that fit me, and that was an extremely hard thing to come by. I weighed 100 pounds and I was 5'2", and everything, I just disappeared inside of the ones for the men, and they didn't make them for women. So it was raincoats, rain gear, none of that was, it was all stuff for men. And you know, when you're in the field and you've got rain pants on and you've got all kinds of gear on and you have to go to the bathroom, it's a challenge, a real challenge. More so back then than now.
You'll be happy to note that the BOW program, the Becoming an Outdoors Woman program, is still very active.
I'm glad.
And almost every class that they run is completely full, and there's usually a wait list.
Yeah,
So
I'm really glad to hear that, because it was such fun to do, and to see the light come on in women's eyes when they realized that they could shoot a rifle, a shotgun, that they could fly cast, that they could do all of that stuff, that there wasn't anything particularly magic about it, except that they hadn't been taught. And they hadn't been taught to believe that they could. And to see that light beginning to grow in their eyes when they realized that they could do it was extremely exciting for me. I'm really glad to hear that it's still going on.
Well, thank you for all of your efforts to keep it moving forward in those early days. That's absolutely what it takes to get that kind of thing off the ground. So, what do you think the hardest thing was to overcome in your career?
The fact that I was a woman, and that had sort of different dimensions to it. When I started to work at Fish and Game, they asked me when I was interviewed if I knew how to shoot a gun, and I said, yeah. I had shot a rifle in 4-H camp when I was 10 years old. I had learned how to shoot a .22, and my dad took me shooting a .22 a couple of times. He didn't want to teach me how to hunt, because he didn't want me seeing him killing an animal. He thought that would upset me, and because I was a girl. Girls don't hunt. So I said I know how to shoot a gun, and I did, but I didn't know how to hunt, but they didn't ask me that. So I had to learn how to hunt, and I had people in the department that kind of took me under their wing and taught me how to hunt. But I was tremendously underprepared for instance, doing wildlife control work in Anchorage. And I remember one time Dave Harkness was he was the area biologist for Anchorage, and a remarkable biologist. He was there a long time, and he was a magnificent biologist in a very challenging position here. But he was unable to go out into town. There was a moose in somebody's backyard. And that meant if the moose wouldn't come out, then Fish and Game had to come out and either dart the moose, which we didn't like to do, and get it out of the yard, haul it out of the yard, or haze it out of the yard, which could be very dangerous depending on the time of year and if there were calves around. And so Dave wasn't available, and so they said, oh, Enid, you're the only one around. All the technicians are off doing something else. You go take care of that moose. Go get a shotgun. I had never been in anybody's yard chasing a moose or anything else, and they never thought to ask that, have you been trained? Has anybody shown you how to do it? Have we gone through any protocol or anything? And so I said, well, okay, I'll do it. And I got in the car and left, and when I got to the house, the moose was gone. I almost fainted with relief. But yeah, training was greatly lacking back then, and that was one of my challenges, both as a technician and as a supervisor. That was another area where there wasn't any training for being a supervisor. And when I moved into the wildlife biology 1 category, I supervised all the technicians in Region 1, in the office in Region 1 and in Region 2, and I didn't have a clue about how to train them or how to supervise them. I was brought up by a very strict set of parents, and I was brought up to do what I was told, and don't give me any guff about it either. So that was what I fell back on when I started supervising. If somebody gave me any guff, I'd get harsh with them. And that wasn't the way to do it. And I finally figured that out. I believe Jackie Kephart was one of the people that learned me about that because she wouldn't take any guff. Not that we ever came to that, but I had to learn a different style of supervision and managing people, and it didn't. I wasn't the only supervisor that got frustrated by that. You don't go into biology because you're really a people person and because you're a good supervisor. You go into biology into wildlife biology because you want to be out in the field and you want to work with animals. And there you are supervising 8 or 9 high school and college age kids, and how do you keep control of everything? And some of them were hard to control. Some of them didn't like working for a woman. They hated it. And they hated me because I was a woman. And that brings me to the other challenge, and that was the fact that I was a woman. When I was hired as a biologist, I was told in no uncertain terms that a good number of the staff were dead set against me working there. And so that was a hurdle from the very beginning. And nobody was hostile to me, but I was under a microscope. I was watched. Everything I did, everything I said, every person I interacted with, everybody was watching me. And I knew it. And it was a lot of pressure. It was a lot of pressure. And so I just did the best I could at that point in time, and I didn't try to fight it. I didn't grab my feminist flag and start waving it around at all. I just tried to fit in, and I quit wearing dresses, and I started wearing jeans and plaid shirts and tennis shoes, and took my high heels off and started. I learned how to hunt, and I learned about firearms. I started to learn how to talk about guns, and I learned how to talk about hunting and killing, and I learned how to swear, and I learned how to be one of the guys. And for quite a long time that worked. That worked pretty well. I didn't make any waves, but that happened later.
Looking back, what part of your career are you most proud of?
Actually, I made some notes about that. There's about 3 things that I am most proud of. I worked for 2 or 3 years with Don Calkins on the Marine Mammals Stellar Sea Lion Project. We were investigating the decline of stellar sea lions in the Gulf of Alaska. And he was one of the men that didn't want me working there. But he eventually came around and we became good friends, and I'm still in contact with Don. I correspond with him on Facebook still quite frequently. But Don came to me and he said, "You have a background in microbiology, do you not?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "I want you to do the disease work on this project. Are you willing to do that?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so he sent me to Corvallis, Oregon, to the University of Oregon there, and I trained with one of the diseases that we were concerned about was San Miguel sea lion virus, which had been shown to be pretty prevalent in the stellar sea lion population up here. And so we were expecting to be sampling for that and to be dealing with that as possibly one of the causes of the decline from the disease end of things. And so I went down there and I learned, they electrocuted a poor pig for me to learn how to do a necropsy on and what to look for to find the lymph nodes and to be able to do take a spinal syringe and draw fluid from the spine and what tissues to sample and so on. And so I came back and had that under my belt, and then we went out on big boats into the Gulf of Alaska for 2 weeks at a time. And Don Calkins was the fairest man I ever worked for. He never gave me any trouble as a woman. He respected what I did, and he demanded that everybody, including the big commercial fishermen on board that were crewing the boats, paid, because I was the only woman on the boat, that they paid me respect too. And he was just wonderful to work for. And we worked very hard, and at that time, the department had permits to shoot sea lions. We shot them from skiffs in the water, or we shot them from places above big haulouts, and we would shoot them from up above, and then collect the bodies and take them to the boat and process them. And eventually, the sea lion population was in such decline that the federal people that were issuing the permits, I believe it was the Marine Mammal Commission, they were reluctant to give us any more permits to kill animals to see why they were dying. There is a certain irony about that. But that was when then that they developed with Dennis McAllister and, oh gosh, I can't remember his last name, a guy named Tom from the Fish and Wildlife, from NOAA, and Terry Spraker, Ted Spraker's brother. He was a veterinary pathologist from Colorado State University. And he helped me some with my disease work, but he was also involved in developing capture techniques for capturing sea lions underwater and anesthetizing them with anesthetic, with a gas anesthetic, so that they could do the sampling in a different way without killing the animal. And so that was a tremendous stride forward in techniques. And I was not working with them at that point, but I was involved in the killing end of things. But that was really exciting work, and boy, it was fantastic being on a boat out on the big ocean and running around the coastline of Alaska, seeing all the marine birds and all the marine life, and it was an amazing experience. And we did a lot of good work on diseases. I was the first one to find that chlamydia was present in sea lions to the extent that it is probably an abortive agent in sea lions. In other words, it causes them to abort. I don't believe that it was enough to really contribute heavily to the decline of sea lions at that time, except if they were under extreme duress otherwise. I think then it would have piled on to the stress that they were already having. But it was there, and nobody had ever found it before, so that was exciting for me.
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely a career highlight.
Yeah,
when you have a
it
chance to
was.
do those kinds of things that nobody's looked at before or found before.
It was fun.
That's incredible.
The other thing was the Harvest Summary Database book. That I'm very proud of that. It was, as Wayne Reglan said when he cut the funding for it, he said, well, this is a Cadillac, and we don't need a Cadillac. We need an old Ford.
That's a good description of it sometimes. The old Ford often does get the job done perfectly well.
But the hunters loved it. But it was quite expensive to produce. Mm-hmm. So I can certainly appreciate why he didn't want to continue it.
Do you want to take it from where he knocked on the door?
Sure, we can.
If you just want to redo that part.
What were we talking about?
Maybe we could start over with talking about the harvest summary.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Why don't you just start asking questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
I can't remember what I said.
I have that on air light out there, but I'm just like pointing at it like, dude.
I heard the thunderous footsteps coming down the hall. They're coming for us.
Okay, hang on 1 second.
No problem. I think you had kind of led into it with one of the other highlights for your career.
Yeah, I was very proud of the Harvest Summary book.
Okay. Sorry. Save me from myself. Thank you.
I knew that was going to happen. GPS guy. So sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. You can start.
Okay, thanks. So we were talking about the highlights of your career, and one of the major contributions was that Harvest Summary
Yeah,
book.
I think it was a major contribution. It was went over extremely well with the hunters. They loved having that book to refer to. It helped them when they went to Board of Game meetings, to the regional meetings that they attended. It helped them craft arguments for new regulations, and it helped them when they wanted to plan hunts. It was very popular for hunters planning hunts, and we sold a lot of books. We charged $20 for a book, which was exactly what it cost us to publish it. So it wasn't a money lost proposition, but it wasn't a money made proposition either. But I'm very proud of that. And it was, Wayne Reglan said it in the meeting where he cut our funding for it. He said it was a Cadillac, but he really didn't need a Cadillac anymore. He needed an old Ford. And so we went backwards, and I was really disappointed. But I also understand, you know, he had funding considerations to take into account. So, but it was a great project while it lasted.
Yeah, that sounds pretty incredible, and I had a chance to look at some of those original publications, and it's really interesting to think about how useful that information is to the public, and also just to the history of the agency, to have all of that captured in one document the way that you did. Mm-hmm. And certainly a huge jumping off point for where we've come since then. And it's pretty incredible that you were in on the ground floor of that operation.
It was fun. It was great. And Susan and Becky and I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in front of Becky's computer proofreading the data and making sure that everything tallied up across and down in multiple columns for hundreds of pages. And we always, at the end of it all, we decided that because we had such a difficult time getting data out of the biologists, that we would put a little test in the Harvest Summary book to see if they actually read anything about their own data. And so we would put in one of the, it was always a fur bearer data, which wasn't that critical in terms of things in print. We would put in our tables, we had how many trappers took how many beaver. And somewhere in the book, for one of the areas, we would have how many beaver took how many trappers. And nobody ever caught it. So we knew they weren't really reading that book. But we always had a big laugh about that. You asked for 3 things that I was most proud of. The other thing was the Information Center. And you know all about the Information Center because you got stuck with that when you first came to the department, you told me. And that was a long time coming, and it was quite a procedure. But it was one of the best things that was ever done in that office, I think. Prior to the Information Center, hunters had to go up to the 2nd floor, go up the stairs, and there was a big window with a sliding door that came down and a counter, and they were called secretaries back then. The secretaries had to issue permits and explain regulations to all the hunters, in addition to all of their secretarial jobs. They had to do that as well, and during permit application period, that was just a nightmare for them. And you know, they weren't paid enough to deal with irate hunters and you know, smelly people that came in right out of the right out of the field with blood and guts still all over them. They weren't paid enough for that, and so the powers that be decided that they were going to take the lab, they were going to do away with the lab, and they were going to put an information center in the lab. And it was my job to kind of design the room and see what we wanted. And Jeff Hughes was the regional supervisor then, and he wanted things a certain way, and I wanted things a different way that was friendlier to the staff that I was going to be supervising. And so we went round and round about some of those things, but he actually acquiesced on almost everything that I wanted, so I was very grateful for that. And we ended up with a very nice information center with a big counter that we didn't have our backs to the hunters when they came in the door. That was a battle, believe it or not, with Jeff Hughes, because he didn't see any reason why we shouldn't be facing the other way when people came into the room. But we got it. And after he spent a little bit of time down there, he understood it too. You know, it's just uncomfortable that way. But yeah, we made a real nice information center, and at first we didn't sell licenses. And we just handed out permits. We explained all the regulations, and had maps all over the place and all kinds of handouts and stuff. I'm sure they still have all of that, but it was new. You know, everything was new. We hadn't had any of that stuff before. It was just little maps up on a little bulletin board up in the front office, and that was it. That was what hunters had to look at, that in their regulation books, and those were pretty miserable for maps. They're not very accurate maps. So that was a big stride forward. And then we started selling licenses. So that was the time we hired Gail Volt. And Gail came to us with, she had a really good grasp of accounting, and she knew how to work the cash register, and she could take care of that end of things just magnificently well, and so that's what she did. And I relied on her to do that. I wasn't very good with the cash register, and I really didn't want to do that. So I was really glad I had Gail to help me out with that. And everybody else that worked there too, they were good sports for the most part. It was hard to be a good sport during permit season, because there were a lot of angry hunters that would come in because they didn't get a permit and the system was rigged. And my buddy over there, he's gotten a permit for the last 20 years, every year, and I haven't gotten any. It's got to be rigged. You know, those arguments are still around, I'm sure. But you had to explain that stuff, and you had to be even about it. You couldn't get mad, and but there were every now and then there were incidents, you know, and because there were women in the information center, we had a couple of guys that worked in there, but the rest of us were women. Sometimes we were targets for hunters, and there were a couple of times when we actually had to call the police in and have individuals escorted out, or the biologists would have to. We had signals, you know, that when it was during that time, the biologists upstairs would just kind of casually cruise through and keep an eye on things. And if one of us gave them, you know, a signal that things were maybe getting out of hand, then some of the bigger guys would come down and offer to escort people out, you know. And so that was how we kind of kept order in the place. But there were also very many really nice people that came in that we dealt with too, that were kind and patient and understanding, and they had educated themselves about a little bit about wildlife management and about management issues, and they were more than happy to bend over backwards to do what they needed to do out in the field so that we could do our job the right way. So that's what made the job so rewarding, were those guys.
Do you recall what year the information center opened in Anchorage?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not recall.
Yeah.
I retired in 2001, so it probably was maybe 1994, 95, somewhere around in there. Does that sound about right to you?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still the busiest information center in the state, and it's certainly still a lot of the same challenges that you just described continue to this day, but it's a great resource to have, and certainly has been a big part of my career at Fish and Game too. So that makes it interesting to think about where it started from.
At one point, I was trying to make a case for hiring more staff in the information center. And it just seemed like every time Jeff Hughes came down into the information center, there was nobody there. And just every time. And he didn't think we had that many people coming in. And I'm sure he knew, in fact, that we had quite a few people, but he never let on that he knew. But at one point, I got a little counter installed above the door. So every time the door opened, it would make a tick. And so at the end of the day, then nobody ever went out at any different door, so we would divide the number of ticks by 2, and that was the number of people that came in. And then we, one day or several days, we did a sampling of how many biologists, how many staff came in and out. So we would, on the average, we would subtract that from the daily total, and that was how many hunters came in. And so eventually I got more staff, because there were days when the number was really quite high, thousands, several thousand people. So that was kind of an eye-opener for everybody, including those of us who worked in there, how many people actually came through over a given period of time. But there was one time when I believe it was it was like the commissioner or somebody like that came in, and he saw that counter up there, and he knew what it was for, and he had a twinkle in his eye, and he stood there, and he opened the door, and he closed the door, and he closed the door. And he knew that we couldn't yell at him because he was the commissioner. But so we had to factor that out that day. Always little challenges to doing our job.
Always. Enid, what do you think was the most dangerous or frightening experience that you had during your career?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I had an encounter that involved the drugs. That was probably the scariest thing. I don't know that it was. Yeah, it was dangerous too. I was with Dennis McAllister, maybe Warren Ballard, and we had when we were tagging bears. This was for the Susitna Hydroelectric Project, which was a huge, years-long environmental impact project that we engaged in. Did a lot of really groundbreaking research on all kinds of species, but it involved a lot of radio collaring animals, and we radio collared wolverines and brown bears, black bears, caribou, pretty much anything that moved. If we could get a collar on it, we did. And there were two things. I'll tell you the most dangerous one first. The most dangerous part didn't happen to me, but it should never have happened. But Dennis McAllister and Warren were I had been dropped off in one place, waiting for Warren and Dennis to come back on the helicopter. They had gone off to put a collar on a bear, and we were doing teams where one team would drop off on a bear, and it was darted from the air, and it would go down, and then a team would drop off and they would process the bear while the next team was dropped off to process a bear that they just darted. So there was kind of a leapfrogging business going on. And I had been dropped off because there were only 3 of us in the helicopter, and they wanted to move all the weight out of there that they could. And so I was waiting, and Dennis and Warren went off, and they were going to do a brown bear, but Warren also saw a wolverine. And he wasn't authorized to dart wolverines, but he had his own little side study going, and he wanted to dart a wolverine, and so they did. Well, the wolverine didn't go down quite as expected, and the dart went in a little too far and wouldn't come out. And anyway, and I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly why the decision was made. But Warren decided that Dennis needed to take this partially anesthetized wolverine in the helicopter and bring it back to me, where I was. And so Dennis, I'm on the ground, and the helicopter lands, the door flies open, and Dennis, who was a legendary technician in his own right, and never ever swore, he was a total gentleman, he never swore. And the door opens, and Dennis flies out with something big and dark in his arms, and he was cussing a blue streak. And my eyes get wide, and he jumps out, and he runs over, and he says, "Sit on it." And it was a wolverine that was, eyes were open, and it was snarling, and it was pissed. Pardon my French. It was very, very angry. And it wasn't anesthetized much at all. And it turned out that the dart was just kind of hanging in its hair. It hadn't actually even gone in. And so we had to put a radio collar on this. So I sat behind it and held its neck while Dennis tried to keep away from its teeth and put the collar on its neck, and off it ran. And we both just went, "Oh, what just happened?" What I can't believe is that the helicopter pilot allowed a live wolverine that wasn't sedated in the helicopter. Can you imagine what would have happened if that wolverine had gotten out of Dennis's arms? And I don't know that anything ever happened. I don't think anybody ever really reported that. But it happened, and it became, you know, lore in Fish and Game about Dennis and the wolverine.
That is a story I've never heard before.
No, I'll bet you didn't. I don't think, and both of those guys have passed away, so I can name names without getting anybody in trouble. But yeah, it was pretty dangerous and very exciting. There was one other, if I am allowed. It was Dennis again and Warren Ballard again. Those 2 guys were trouble, I'll tell you. We had darted a huge brown bear boar, and we had given it M99, and it was down, and we'd gotten the teeth and put a collar on and put tags on its ears. And we were waiting for the helicopter to come back, and we were down in a gully. And there were the helicopter could land only on the top of this ridge that was behind us. It was a fairly steep ridge. And so we had to time everything just right so that, well, first of all, the sound of a helicopter can rouse an animal from sedation. And especially if they've been tagged before, they kind of are primed. And so we didn't want that to happen. But we also had to time the administration of the antidote so that we would be out of the way before the bear woke up. But we didn't want to wait until the helicopter came, so we kind of had to guess when the helicopter was going to come. We didn't have radio contact with the helicopter to find out. So Dennis, who was kind of an adrenaline junkie, and he kind of liked to live on the edge, and so he talked Warren into waiting and waiting and waiting until we gave the antidote. And so finally, the helicopter hadn't come back, and we had to give the bear the antidote. And so then we had to kind of stick around for a little while to make sure that everything went okay, because sometimes they can re-narcotize, but everything did go okay. But we were right down there on the ground with the bear when the bear came up. He came up very fast. And so we had to run up that hill before the bear got its bearings. And this was very angry, again, kind of like the Wolverine, not happy. He got up, and by that time we were just a little ways up this hill, and we had to run up that hill with a big brown bear, very angry, in hot pursuit. And just as we got to the top, just as the bear was within about 15 yards of us, the helicopter landed. He came down and landed really fast. And the prop wash ran the bear off, and we jumped into the helicopter, and I said, Dennis, if you ever do that again, I'm gonna. But we lived, and it makes a fairly good story now. But those were the two scariest times that I've had.
Oh, those are incredible examples. What do you think makes a great wildlife manager?
A manager. Well, I think there's two things that you have to have in equal proportion, and that is you have to be a good biologist. You have to be a really good biologist, hands-on biologist, and you have to be a really good people person. You have to be able to work with the public, whatever public is yours to work with. Certainly, out in the bush, you've got to be able to deal with the native community very well. And I think that's challenging for some people. For other people, it isn't a challenge at all, and they're the ones that really excel. But you've got to be a good biologist. You've got to care about the resource. That has to be your primary concern, and you have to be a good people person because you've got to get your public to see your point of view, to accept the biology that you are doing, and to understand the whys and the wherefores of what it is that you're doing, and to understand that in the long run it benefits everybody to do good, responsible wildlife management. And it's hard sometimes for the hunting public and the subsistence public to understand the long run. It's hard for the long view to be taken. But I think those are the two things that I would say were the most important.
Kind of on that same track, what do you think are 3 skills that a good wildlife biologist has to have?
I think he has to be good with data, because that's one of his big jobs is collecting data accurately, caring about what he's collecting and how the data is massaged, and making sure that it's done honestly and accurately. So collecting the data, working with that. I think, of course, they have to be good outdoorsmen. They have to be really good in the outdoors. And I'm talking area biologist management. I can't speak to regional management. That's a whole different ball of wax. But I've worked with enough of the area biologists to know that all of them that were very, very good were consummate outdoorsmen. And they were passionate about hunting and trapping and fishing, and they knew the hunter's side of it as well as the management, the biology and the agency side of it. They knew both sides intimately, and I think, and they were, again, this goes back to people skills, the very best ones have been accepted by the people in their region, in their areas, and that's of paramount importance as well. If you're not accepted, if they don't like you, your goose is cooked.
So for someone who is thinking about becoming a wildlife biologist, We have a lot of young career professionals and a lot of college students who are involved with the Alaska chapter. Why would you encourage someone to become a wildlife biologist?
Well, I can't speak to the way it is now. I can only speak to the way it was when I was there. But wildlife biology has always been kind of a romantic, exciting, adventurous career in the minds of many. And again, I don't know what it's like now. I suppose a lot of things are done from remote sensing and that kind of thing. I don't know if that's impacted on the ground stuff, but I think it still is pretty exciting and adventurous and romantic. It's you're doing good for wildlife, and in this world it seems that, I mean, it's always going to be an uphill battle, because in this world wildlife never wins. It seems like humans always win. Wildlife hardly ever wins. And the tally is growing daily. You know, it's a terribly difficult battle to wage, given all the things that have to be balanced to keep wildlife healthy and safe, thriving, and sustainable. I mean, it's just it's a tremendous challenge. So passion, they have to have passion for it. They have to love animals, they have to love the outdoors. I don't think you necessarily have to be a hunter to be a good wildlife manager, but you certainly have to have an affinity for wildlife that is not romanticized, that is not anthropomorphized. You know, they are not teddy bears out there in the world. I remember when I was working at McNeil River for 2 weeks one time, this guy, and we were standing on the platform and watching these brown bears very close to us, just a few feet away, and this guy turns to Larry Omeler and he says, "So what are these bears like in the wild?" And Larry said, "They are in the wild." And that was a totally alien concept to this guy. He thought it was a zoo. He really believed that these were, you know, sort of staggering, but that's anthropomorphizing in a way, because and then there's the people that don't think any animal should ever be killed, and that's an erroneous thing too. You know, I'm going to probably step on millions of toes here, but none of us would be here if our ancestors hadn't hunted. And I feel very, very strongly about that. I think as long as it's done ethically and responsibly, I'm not a big fan of sport hunting, but I mean of trophy hunting, but I am a big fan of sport hunting and subsistence hunting and hunting for food. And I think anybody that wants to be a biologist has got to care about animals in a realistic way. Loving them to death isn't going to cut it, but loving them enough to do the things that need to be done to preserve their habitat, to preserve their food sources, especially in the world that we have now with a really rapidly changing climate. I think those are things that you know, the foresight, the vision to be able to do that, the passion to be able to carry it out, and you know, the on-the-ground skills, in the office skills to be able to do the paperwork required to carry it out. Those are things that people that want to go into that field need to be cognizant of. They need to know that there's a lot of paperwork. It isn't all fun out in the field. The technicians have all the fun out in the field. If you want to have fun in the field, you need to be a technician, not a biologist. Isn't that true?
That is so true. Many of my favorite people say that they wish they'd just stayed as technicians for their career because it was the most fun that they'd ever had. And, but there's a lot of value in taking on some of these other challenges too.
The best technicians I've ever known, one of them was Benny Ballinger in Kodiak. He was legendary. And he never was anything but a Tech 5, and that's all he wanted to be. Dennis McAllister was another one. He was legendary. He could do anything with a skiff, and he could do anything underwater. And he was fearless, absolutely fearless. And they had all the fun, and neither one of them, both of those guys were offered promotions repeatedly. Didn't want them. They just wanted to do the field work, and they were, for them, that was absolutely the right decision.
I can see that. As part of the Wildlife Society, how did that help your career? Or how involved were you?
I wasn't real involved. I'm not sure, I hate to say this, but I'm not sure that it actually helped my career, because in many respects, I wasn't ever really considered a real biologist at Fish and Game, because of my kind of peripheral roles that I played always. Yeah, there wasn't, and there really wasn't any help that could be given to me, because there were no opportunities, any real opportunities for advancement. There was one opportunity, and I was the most qualified for it, but because of cronyism, I didn't get it. I was passed over, and I was given all the responsibility for the job, but not any of the promotion of the job. So they split the job and gave me all the supervisory stuff, and the other guy got the promotion. But that was cronyism, pure and simple, nothing else to it. The guy that hired me didn't want his best friend to be disappointed one more time. So I'm not sure in that climate that any professional society could have done me much good at all. That's the where and why of it, yeah.
Yeah, there were certainly a lot of challenges in the early days of Alaska as a state, and the career that we've chosen, and a lot of those have improved since then. I'm happy to report, but there's certainly always challenges as a wildlife biologist, and sometimes more than others.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what are your thoughts on the future of the profession?
Well, I think things look good. As long as there's wildlife, there's a profession to be had. And I think as the years go by and wildlife becomes, their habitat becomes smaller and smaller, whether it's because of forces of nature or forces of man, the need for wise management becomes even more critical. I think as long as there's a population of animals anywhere, there's going to be a need for someone to be caretaker. And that's really what we are. We're caretakers. We don't just take care of them, we watch over them and help them survive as a population. Perhaps not as individuals, but as a population. That's our whole point, I believe.
Yeah, that role of stewardship and conservation is so important to what we do. So, as kind of a parting conversation or a parting question, what words of advice do you have for today's biologists?
Oh, maybe a couple of inspirational words. Like I was starting to mention before, never stop striving for excellence. It's very easy, the longer you're in a job, especially for a government agency, and you can get caught up in the aspect of promotions and moving up into the organization, and if you're good, you're going to be urged to do that. But sometimes people get promoted up beyond where they should be. And they do it for various reasons, but sometimes it's just because they want to make more money or they want to have more power. And in that case, they have lost sight of their primary reason for being in the job. I'm not saying you shouldn't take a promotion, but I think you must strive very hard not to lose sight of the fact that you are there to take care of a resource that is irreplaceable when it's all gone. There's no more to come if they're all gone. So that's our final goal, is to keep them in this world. And it's easy to lose your passion, it's easy to lose your enthusiasm and your long view if you get just ground down by the agency and the bureaucracy and all the stuff that goes on in any office, anywhere. It's easy after a long time to lose that perspective and to lose that freshness that you had when you came in. You know, the new guys are all full of enthusiasm, and they're going to change the wildlife world, and that can go away too easily. So it's a job to keep it going. It's a job to keep it alive. And that's sort of my second point, is to never forget that the resource is your real priority. That whatever you do in research, whatever you do in developing techniques or analytical procedures or papers that you write or meetings that you go to or stuff you do out in the field, it's all about one thing, and that is managing the resource and keeping it healthy and viable. And I don't think the biologists necessarily lose sight of that fact, but they get tired of the battle. And that can be debilitating. They can just kind of sit back on their haunches when they get 25 years into the job and skate. And I've known a few that have done that. And they aren't serving anybody or anything very well when they do that. And that's another thing that's quite hard to maintain over a long period of time, because agencies have a way of grinding you down. They can do that. And it's nothing deliberate. It's just the way bureaucracies are. We are at the whim of people from admin and the governor's office and all kinds of places. We work at their pleasure, and sometimes it's discouraging and it's upsetting and it's hurtful and disappointing, and it's hard to overcome those things sometimes. So keep the spirits up however you can.
Absolutely. It sounds like you've worked with a number of really wonderful people
I did.
over the years. And even amongst all of those challenges, clearly those are some lifelong friendships that you made.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such an amazing thing to think about. And it's such a small community of wildlife biologists and wildlife professionals. And it's been really great hearing it directly from you and hearing some of those names of people that I've also known for over a decade now and over most of my career, and also to hear about where they came from. It's been incredible to have a chance to actually talk to you in person after all of these years of just hearing about you instead. And you've had a pretty incredible career, and I'm so glad that we had a chance to actually sit down and talk today.
And I thank you so much for the opportunity. I thank you so much.
I appreciate that the chapter and also TWS National think that this is important, because it is. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And it's so important to actually have a chance to document these conversations from people who lived through those difficult transitional times, and certainly gives us a place to start from as we keep moving forward.
Absolutely. It's what the Wildlife Foundation
The Wildlife
Society is
yeah.
doing is wow, it's mind-boggling that they're actually doing this. I don't know of any other agency, do you, that does this? Any other group that in our field that is doing that kind of thing? It's a magnificent legacy to leave behind, you know, because what you guys are doing is getting a sampling from the whole strata. You're not just getting the guys at the top. You're talking to people from all levels. And that's where if you look at all of them, you're going to see a picture coalesce of what it really was like from all points of view. And every point of view is valid because they were all there. They were all there for it. They all experienced it. And that's so valuable. It's a wonderful thing, and it's such an honor to be a part of that. I thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. It's been absolutely my pleasure to visit with you today.